Hi everybody, different topic today. I've talked a lot about gold and silver. In fact, I've probably talked about them to death, and I've covered pretty much everything that you need to know about monetary metals. So I thought I'd switch the topics today and talk about something that's probably a little bit more interesting. And this is in response to one of my viewers who asked me about what I think the future might look like and what we can do about it. Now, you all know that I'm a big believer in peak oil, meaning that over time oil becomes a little bit more difficult to take out of the ground to the point where it becomes even non-economic to extract. And as a consequence, we go to more and more difficult to obtain sources of energy, such as offshore oil, and now we're starting to dip into tight oil and shale. Now, over time, what that's going to mean is that energy is going to become more and more expensive and less readily available to the common everyday person. So I think if we want to think about what the future might look like, what we ought to do is take a look at what the past looked like when energy was less available to us and when we weren't being subsidized by the rest of the world. Now, one thing I'd like to focus on right now is food preservation. So I started off by showing you a picture of my refrigerator. You can see my kitchen here. It's a little bit dirty, but one thing that we take for granted is refrigeration as a method for preserving our food. Now, you've all noticed that food's become more expensive over the past 10 years, and I firmly believe that part of that is a result of the fact that energy is becoming more expensive. And that's in addition to the fact that the Fed's just printing lots and lots of cash. But part of it has to do with the fact that energy is becoming more expensive, and so we can expect that a greater percentage of our budget is going to be spent on food in the future. Much like the energy budget or the budgets that our grandparents and great-grandparents had, they spent a greater percentage of their income on food than we do today, and especially more than we did maybe 10 or 20 years ago. Now, one thing that's been very common for people is we take food supplies for granted, and if things go bad, we think, well, no big deal, let's just throw it away. We don't think twice about buying more than we need at the grocery store and then having to throw away the little bit that goes bad. But 100 years ago, people wouldn't dream about doing that. And part of the reason why we take it for granted is the fact that we have refrigeration, so we can put a lot of food in our refrigerator, and it stays pretty good for maybe a week, maybe even a couple weeks for vegetables. But eventually things do go bad, especially things that are left in the back of our fridge. Now, in the future, I think that we're going to need to be a little bit more careful with our methods of food preservation. We're going to need to probably buy only what we think we're going to be able to use, and any additional food supplies that we don't think that we can use, we're going to need to think carefully about how to preserve it. Now, refrigeration is not the best method, especially in the future, because I can also see a condition where our electrical grid becomes less and less reliable because the utility companies just aren't maintaining it the way that they used to. And it's going to become more and more difficult to maintain it in the future because credit's going to become much less readily available to utilities, which are very credit dependent. And so what we're going to see in the future is electricity is probably going to become much, much more expensive, making refrigeration much more expensive. Plus, we're probably going to see periods of time, days, maybe even weeks, when some homes are going to be without power simply because parts of the grid just break down. So refrigeration is probably not the best way to rely on for preserving food. And so I wanted to discuss different methods of preserving food, and today I'm going to focus on one that's one of my favorites, and that is lacto-fermentation. Now, most of you are probably familiar with methods of canning, but probably not familiar with lacto-fermentation. So let me talk about the principle a little bit. Basically, what lacto-fermentation is it's preventing food from seeing oxygen. See, all food comes with bacteria basically laced on it, right? You'll never see food coming out of the ground that's bacteria-free unless it's just sprayed with all kinds of pesticides and chemicals. But the good food generally has the seeds of its own destruction sown into it. And the bacteria can be good, and it can also be bad. The bad bacteria relies upon oxygen. So the bacteria that spoils food and the bacteria that creates pathogens that can affect our health basically require oxygen in order to propagate. But the good bacteria, that is the lactic acid bacteria, they basically prefer to have an oxygen-starved environment. So one way that you can preserve vegetables, for example, is to dice them real thin. Here I show that I have some string beans that I'm probably not going to get around to eating, and some zucchini that I wasn't going to get around to eating, and so I'm going to preserve it through lactic acid fermentation. And the easiest way to do it is just to dice it up real fine, put it into a ball jar. You can get ball jars at your supermarket very easily, and you just prepare a brine. Now, here I show you a brine. I just made it. It's just a couple cups worth of water with a tablespoon and a half of salt. That's about the right proportion that you want to use. For larger quantities, basically 3 tablespoons to a quart is about what you want. What the salt does is it also further inhibits the growth of harmful bacteria. And so the brine is ready. All we need to do is just fill the jar up to the point where the brine is covering to the top of the vegetables. There we go. Alright, and then what we can do is we can put a lid on it. Now, what you want to do is put the lid on fairly loosely, because once the good bacteria take over and start to ferment the vegetables, what's going to end up happening is it's going to release carbon dioxide. And if you put the lid on it tightly, what will happen is your jar will explode. You don't want that. So just keep the lid on loosely, and actually if you're equipped, a better way to do it is actually to use a lid that has an airlock. So here you can see an airlock. This particular lid is designed so that as the pressure inside the jar builds up, the carbon dioxide will come out through the center tube, bubble through the water, and come out. And this makes sure that no oxygen can go in through the top and spoil the vegetables. See, what happens is if you get oxygen coming in, it will basically promote the growth of mold on the top of the vegetables, which is something that you don't want. Okay, so basically the way that this works is the lactic acid bacteria will basically grow, and the other bacteria will die off. What you're doing is you're creating an environment which actually prefers the good bacteria, and the good bacteria will grow, carbon dioxide will be released, but it will also create lactic acid. And the lactic acid will give this a nice tart taste, and the acidity of the vegetables at that point will further inhibit the growth of bad bacteria, to the point where it will actually keep at room temperature for several weeks. You don't need refrigeration at all, and if you do refrigerate it, it'll basically last pretty much for half a year or so. It has a very, very long shelf life. Now it is an acquired taste. Okay, it will taste quite strong. It's going to taste like pickles when it's done, which a lot of people do like, but you have to get used to it. So this is basically lactic acid fermentation in a nutshell. You can do it in a ball jar. If you care to, you can buy something a little bit more advanced. I have a 5-liter crock here. It's basically a German fermentation crock. It's what people used to use 100 years ago for preserving large quantities of vegetables, and it has a very special design. You can see the lid here is basically designed so that you can fill this upper channel with water, and that creates a nice oxygen seal that prevents the oxygen from getting inside the vessel, and it allows the carbon dioxide to bubble out. But this allows you to make very large quantities of vegetables. You put it inside, you put the brine in, any other spices that you might want, and within a couple weeks' time, what you'll have is, if you're using cabbage, for example, you'll have sauerkraut, or you can have any other kind of vegetables you want, and it'll keep them, real nice for you. Okay, now, of course, the word fermentation, a lot of people are familiar with. They connotate it with making alcoholic beverages, and that is in fact one of the ways of making alcoholic beverages. You don't have to use it for preserving vegetables. It's very, very much more useful than that. In fact, what I'm showing you here, here's another fermentation I'm doing right now. I also make beer and wine at home, and they tend to be very tasty. But here what I'm doing is I'm actually making hard apple cider. So what I did, I'm using the same method. The lids are very loosely screwed on, but I basically have some pressed apples in there, some apple juice, and there's no brine. It's just the apple juice itself with some fresh sliced apples on the top. I stir that once per day, and what will happen is the yeasts that are naturally present on the apples will start the fermentation going. And again, it's the same mechanism that the fermentation will proceed, and because it's yeast that's present on fruit, instead of getting lactic acid like you do in the case of vegetables, what you will get is basically alcohol. And again, CO2 is liberated, so you have to keep those lids on real loosely, otherwise your cider will blow up on you. But in about a week's time, what you'll have is hard apple cider. So, a lot of people think that you have to buy alcohol at the store. That's not true. In fact, you don't even have to go to a beer and wine making supply shop. You don't need to go there and get the yeasts, because natural fruit has yeasts on it already. And you can make alcoholic beverages out of just about any kind of fruit juice, whether it's apple juice, grape juice, pear juice. Just be creative, and you can have a lot of fun with it. I also have some peach juice going back here. You can see the fermentation lids on the top. The airlocks allowing the carbon dioxide to escape. The fermentation is pretty much done on these, so you won't be seeing the bubbling right now. But anyway, that's just a basic overview of lactic acid fermentation. I do recommend that you give it a try, because it does create very tasty food and very tasty alcoholic beverages, and there are certain health benefits to it as well. One thing that it does is it creates a living food. A lot of people are freaked out about having bacteria in their food, but actually the bacteria that's in this food is actually present in your stomach anyway. In fact, the bacteria will actually aid in digestion. The bacteria actually helps with your immune system. And you probably didn't know this, but about 90% of the cells in your body are actually not your own cells, but actually foreign cells, mainly bacteria, that assist in digestion and immune system response. They're what provide the primary barrier against harmful bacteria. And unlike heat treating and canning, this is absolutely safe, because what you're doing is you're creating an environment that's absolutely hostile to the harmful bacteria. Whereas with heat treating, what you're doing is you're boiling vegetables inside a crock or something else, raising it to the boiling point of water, which will kill all of the bacteria present inside the food, with the exception of one, which is Clostridium botulinum, which is the most harmful bacteria known to man. I mean, it's ever present in soils and everywhere, so we're always exposed to it. But what creates botulism is actually when that Clostridium botulinum is the only thing that's left, because it's not killed at boiling temperatures of water. You have to get it up to about 150, 160 degrees C in order to kill it. But it's what's left behind. It has nothing to compete with it. And when you put it into a vacuum jar, it creates a perfect environment for the Clostridium botulinum to create spores, which are one of the biggest toxins known to mankind. They're one of the most dangerous things you can eat. So the method I'm showing you here is actually safer for food preservation than heat treating and canning, unless you have a pressure canner. But it creates a living food that's very tasty. I do recommend that you give it a try. Develop a taste for this kind of food, experiment with it, see how long your vegetables and your fruits last, and just have fun. So anyway, that's the first video in this series. I'll cover a different method of food preservation in a future video. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.